Well, Gauteng residents are wondering who will end up in charge given the current state of coalition politics. For example, Mayor Phalatse may be ousted again because the numbers have been against her in the past and her own party has stated its disapproval of her plan to work with the EFF. Meanwhile, last night in Ekhuruleni, the DA Mayor Tanya Campbell was kicked out in a vote of no confidence. She was elected with the help of the EFF after the local government elections, but that party abstaining from voting yesterday. With so many split councils, the smaller parties are increasingly becoming pivotal to the decisions around who gets the mayoral chair. Some of these parties only have one seat. Well, to discuss, we're joined by the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick. Angelo, thank you for being with us. Nelson Mandela Bay was the model of instability, perhaps because of the power of small parties like the UDM at the time. Then came the local government elections and coalition governments popped up all over the show. Is this now Gauteng's curse?
Well, coalition governments themselves are not necessarily the problem. It is that because South Africa is new to coalition government, it may be that the individual parties involved in these coalitions are still feeling their way into this. Unfortunately, as all South Africans know, we're in a situation where we can't afford, as residents of these metropolitan spaces and of these towns, to have people on a learning curve because the cost to us is quite severe. And so here it is necessary for political parties to begin to think not just in their short-term gain about which seat they're going to get on some executive council, but in the medium to longer term about their survivability as parties if they continue to alienate voters by creating these instabilities which result in the interruptions that Dr. Phalatse was talking about and that other residents across the country have felt when there is a change of administration.
I'm interested to know, do you think she was crazy to go to the courts? I mean, even the judges keep saying we don't want to get involved in politics. Politics should play out in the councils, and she lost and she may lose again, depending on the numbers, but it looks very likely.
I don't think she's crazy. I think she's quixotic, because part of the crisis that Dr. Phalatse will face as mayor of Johannesburg is this conflict that is arising between her division of the Democratic Alliance at the municipal level and the priorities and statements of the national division of the party in relation to alliance partners in government. So the coalition partners may take great exception to statements being made by national officials that Dr. Phalatse and her peers in the DA in the city of Johannesburg may end up paying the price for. And this, I think, is what has happened in Ekhuruleni. Coalitions of spite, of course, won't work. We've known this from 2016. And so it's important that when coalitions are drawn up between smaller and slightly bigger parties, that the stakes for everyone involved is made clear and that everyone's role is negotiated up front. The problem in South Africa is, of course, that if personal spats kick in and such, smaller parties have absolutely no reason to stick to any kind of agreement. They can leave a coalition, and so it becomes a much more difficult task for parties like the Democratic Alliance and in future the African National Congress to manage their relationships with individuals who could be very, very pivotal. And Helen Zille, for all of the flaws and flaks that people fling at her in recent years, when she was mayor of Cape Town, managed that relationship with parties that were very, very small, where one seat could often pivot the direction of policy decisions, managed that fairly well. And I think it is important that people across the board, in all parties, particularly the three bigger ones, begin to think of how they're going to manage their relationships with those smaller parties to prevent the kind of collapse into chaos that we've seen across Gauteng in this very, very pivotal moment.
Well, how do you manage the smaller parties? The ANC, for example, obviously thought they were very important in Joburg. I think it was the ATM that had less than 0.5% of the vote, but got a seat on the mayoral committee. So then you have a party that its status and its seats don't reflect the number of votes it received. Is that good for democracy or bad for democracy? Should you give these smaller parties mayoral seats, or, like the DA say, join us, but accept that we are the much bigger party here?
So again, there's absolutely nothing untoward in this. Around the world, there are coalitions where there are people who get seats in power with very, very small margins that allow them those seats because they push the bigger party that is still a minority party into power. The difficulty is managing this process. And of course, the ATM and the ANC have their own history from the previous administration of the ANC. And so the question isn't necessarily about whether or not a smaller party suddenly gets an immense amount of power. The question is whether the larger party in that coalition is able to manage the coalition and steer it in the direction of their particular supporters' mandate. Because if you don't, then you damage your own party, as I think senior officials in the DA have become very, very concerned with. Or, on the alternative, you allow that smaller party and its relationship with the other smaller parties in a multi-party coalition to shift the, shall we say, mandate away from what your manifesto declared more and more in relation to theirs. And so, horse trading happens in politics all the time. It happens inside parties. When it happens across party lines, I think South African politicians are still in the unfortunate teething phase of this process. And South Africa's people, the people who live in this country, I think are tired and can't afford the teething problems to result in the kinds of back and forth shifting in and out of power of different administrations. Because, service delivery gets interrupted and new plans are abandoned, other plans are instituted. And the city of Tshwane is an example of how the instability results in all sorts of chances for new forms of maladministration and fruitless and wasteful expenditure, because processes are put in place, money is being spent on getting those processes going, they're then abandoned, new processes replace them, and new money has to follow that.
Going forward, would you agree with me that the DA has some concerns? It's been accused of being arrogant by these small parties, and you say that globally it has to be accepted that they can get that sort of outsized power, as it were. They've been accused of being arrogant by the small parties, and they're not working with the EFF, that's suddenly changing its mind and not voting in all cases against the ANC. So could that put the DA in danger across the municipalities that it holds tentatively?
Absolutely. It puts any big party that doesn't have an outright majority or even a near majority. So if you're at 47%, you can still manage if there are just 2 or 3 parties or even 1 or 2 parties with 4 seats that can push you over the majority line. But if you're governing as the bigger party in a multi-party coalition, you're sitting at the 40% or sometimes in the 30s, you run the risk of having the instability that we're currently seeing recur as those smaller parties want an increasingly bigger stake in governance and or whatever it is that they're demanding, and you may not want to deliver that, in which case they walk away from the coalition and may join the official opposition in those chambers, and that causes all sorts of problems. I think also what has happened in South Africa is that the EFF has often said it won't, has before said it won't join a coalition, but it will simply exercise its vote as if it is in the opposition benches after supporting a particular coalition. And that, I think, is also partly why we see some kinds of instability, because if the coalition misses out not just one but 2 of the other big parties, it's very difficult to push shifts through. And of course, local government in South Africa has a very massive task ahead of it, because it has to undo the spatial logics of colonialism and apartheid. It has to do local economic development, and those are all, those require integrated planning and integrated delivery. And if people are, back and forth spatting about ideological differences that are not necessarily in the municipality, that is a problem. And I think South Africa can learn very much from a state like Germany, where multi-party coalitions are formed because people have mutual interests at heart that aren't about keeping somebody else out of power. They're actually about delivering specific things. And I think in future, election manifestos for some of the bigger parties will have to include what they're willing to concede and who they're willing to work with in a coalition. Because the alternative is the kind of chaos that we're seeing now, which will take our already imperiled cities into much greater risk. And there are multiple challenges to life itself in South Africa over the next 2 decades. We can't afford shambles among our elected officials, resulting, and particularly also because we don't have a professionalized civil service that will keep things running while the political heads fight it out in chambers.
I agree with you, even though all the politicians are talking about service delivery and they want to restore it. Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. That was Angelo Fick, Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute in Johannesburg.